My daughter-in-law looked me up and down in my own kitchen and said, "Honestly, Evelyn, you can't keep living like this. It's embarrassing for all of us." What she didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that the building she and my son were standing in was one of 11 properties I owned across Ontario. I didn't say a word. I just set down my tea and looked out the window. I want to tell you how we got there. I grew up in Sudbury, the second of 4 kids, in a house where the heat sometimes got turned off in February because my father had a habit of spending his paycheck before it made it to the bills. I learned early that money was something you either controlled or it controlled you. I chose the former. I worked my first real job at 16 cashier at a grocery store on La Salle Boulevard, and I saved more than half of everything I earned, not because someone told me to, because I had seen what happened when you didn't. I put myself through a 2-year accounting program at Cambrian College and worked my way into a property management firm in Hamilton. Over the next 20 years, while I was raising my son Thomas, largely on my own after his father left. When Thomas was 4, I learned everything I could about how real estate actually worked. Not from the outside, from the inside. I managed other people's buildings, watched them make money while I kept their books, and quietly, carefully, I started buying. A duplex here, a small commercial strip there. Nothing flashy. Nothing that anyone would have noticed if they weren't paying attention. Thomas didn't pay attention. I don't say that with cruelty. He was a good boy in many ways. He had his father's charm and, unfortunately, some of his father's assumptions that the world was arranged to provide for him, that comfort was a given rather than something built. I sent him to a good school. I made sure he had what he needed and a little of what he wanted. I drove a used Civic for 11 years so he could have hockey camp and school trips and, eventually, a down payment on a condo in Kitchener when he was 28. He met Claire at a work event. She came from a family in North York, her father in finance, her mother, who had never worked a day in their marriage and seemed to regard that fact as an achievement. They were the kind of people who talked about their cottage the way some people talk about a second heartbeat. Always there, always central, always evidence of something. I liked Claire well enough at first. She was sharp, well presented, and she made Thomas laugh. What I didn't fully see until they got married was how much she had absorbed her mother's particular way of measuring people, not by character, by appearance. The first winter after their wedding, they came to visit me at my house in Ancaster. A modest place, nothing remarkable, 3 bedrooms, older kitchen that I had never gotten around to updating because, frankly, I had no interest in updating it. I had lived there comfortably for 14 years. Claire walked through the front door, looked at the laminate countertops, and said to Thomas, not to me, to Thomas, as if I weren't standing right there, "Oh, this is cozy." The way she said cozy. I have thought about that word many times since. Over the next 2 years, the comments accumulated the way small debts do. Nothing dramatic. Just a steady, quiet erosion. My car was too old. My clothes were too plain. I mentioned once that I'd clipped some coupons for the grocery run, and Claire looked at me the way you might look at someone who had just announced they were still using a rotary phone. Thomas said nothing. That was the part that stayed with me longer than anything Claire said. Thomas said nothing. In the spring of the year, Thomas turned 33. His company transferred him to a new position in Mississauga. Claire was pregnant with their first child. They started, very gently at first, suggesting that it might make more sense. For everyone, they said, always for everyone, if they moved in with me temporarily while they looked for a larger place. My house was bigger than their condo. It made practical sense. I said yes because Thomas was my son, and because I thought it would be a chance for things to be better between us. It was not a chance for things to be better. Within 6 weeks of moving in, Claire had rearranged my kitchen. She'd moved my things to make room for hers, replaced my dish rack with one she'd bought, and taped a little printed schedule to the laundry room door. When I pointed it out, she said she was just trying to keep things organized. Thomas backed her up. He said I should try to be flexible. I was 61 years old. I had built a life from nothing. I was being asked to be flexible in my own home. I didn't argue. I went to bed that night and lay in the dark and thought very carefully about what I was going to do. I want to be precise about something. What happened over the following months was not impulsive. It was not emotional. I had been a careful person my entire life, and I was going to be careful now. But I had also spent 61 years understanding that at some point you have to stop waiting for people to see you and simply show them. The comments from Claire escalated slowly and then all at once. She mentioned to her mother on a phone call I wasn't meant to hear but did, that I was a bit of a charity case, honestly. She told Thomas that the neighborhood I lived in was fine, but not really where they wanted to raise a child. She started referring to the house, my house, our place, in conversations with her friends. Once, when I came downstairs in my house dress at 7 in the morning, she looked up from her laptop and said, with a little laugh, "Evelyn, you might want to put something nicer on before we have people over later." I said mildly that I hadn't realized anyone was coming. "We mentioned it," she said, which they had not. Thomas, when I brought it up privately, told me that Claire was just stressed with the pregnancy and that I needed to give her grace. I looked at my son for a long moment. He had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable, but he did not say anything more. The week after my granddaughter was born, a healthy girl born at St. Joseph's in Hamilton, Thomas came to me in the kitchen one evening while Claire was resting. He sat down across from me and said in the careful tone of someone who had rehearsed that they had been thinking, that the house was getting cramped, that Claire's parents had offered to help them buy something larger, and that they thought it might make more sense for me to look at. And here he paused, searching for the right word, a retirement option. Something comfortable. For someone at your stage. I asked him what stage he meant. He said, "Mom, you're on a fixed income. It just makes more sense." I looked at my son who had grown up in houses I paid for, who had learned to drive in a car I bought, whose hockey equipment and school trips and, yes, his down payment, had all come from accounts he had never once asked about. My son who sat across from me in my kitchen and told me I was on a fixed income. I said, "I see." He said, "It's not personal, Mom. It's just practical." I said, "I know." I didn't sleep that night either, but not because I was upset. Because I was thinking very clearly, and when I think very clearly, I tend to find sleep unnecessary. I called my lawyer in the morning. Her name is Beverly, and she has been handling my affairs for 15 years. I told her what I needed. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Evelyn, are you certain?" And I said yes. She said she would have the paperwork started by end of week. Then I called my accountant. Then I called the property management company that handled 2 of my buildings in Guelph. Then I made coffee and I sat at my kitchen table, and I read the newspaper, which I still get in print because I like the feeling of it, and I watched the birds at the feeder I had hung in the backyard 12 years ago, and I felt, for the first time in several months, entirely calm. Here is what Thomas and Claire did not know. The house in Ancaster was mine, free and clear, no mortgage. I had paid it off 6 years earlier. Beyond that, I owned 2 duplexes in Hamilton, a 4-unit in Brantford, a small commercial property on King Street in Waterloo that I leased to a dental office and an accounting firm, 3 rental condos in Guelph, and a mixed-use building in Cambridge that I had purchased quietly in 2019 for just under $2 million. There was also a self-storage facility on the edge of Burlington that my late business partner Gerald and I had developed together in 2014, and which I had bought out his family's share of when he passed. In total, the portfolio was valued, as of the previous autumn's assessment, at just over $8 million. The income it generated, after expenses, management fees, and taxes, was comfortable. I was not on a fixed income. I was not on any income that Thomas had ever thought to ask about. I had never hidden any of it. I had simply never announced it. There is a difference. My father used to say that the loudest person in the room is rarely the most powerful. I had believed that my whole life. I had worn sensible shoes and driven used cars and clipped my coupons and let people draw their conclusions. I had watched people underestimate me my entire career, and I had found it mostly useful. What I had not expected was that my own son would become one of those people. I gave them the standard notice, 60 days, written, delivered by hand on a Tuesday morning while they were both at home. I set it on the kitchen table, my kitchen table, and I said calmly that I would be reclaiming the property at end of term, and that I hoped the time would give them an opportunity to make other arrangements. Claire stared at the paper. Then she stared at me. She said, "You can't do this." "We have a baby," I said. "I am aware. You have 8 weeks, and I am happy to be a resource if you need help thinking through your options." Thomas said, "Mom." "What is this?" I said, "It's a notice of termination of occupancy. Beverly drafted it. It's all standard." He said, "Beverly?" "My lawyer," I said. "You've met her at the estate review in 2018. She was at the house." He stared at me the way you stare at someone when you suddenly cannot quite locate who they are. I recognized the moment. I had seen it before in business when someone I'd been negotiating with finally understood that I knew something they had assumed I didn't. It is not a comfortable moment to be on either side of. "I don't understand," he said. "I know," I said. What followed was not clean. I won't pretend it was. There were phone calls from Claire's mother, who had opinions she delivered at considerable volume. There was a conversation with Thomas that ended with him saying things he would later apologize for, including a comment about my lifestyle that told me everything I needed to know about what had been said in their room after I went to bed at night. Claire's father called and offered, in the tone of someone conferring a favor, to have his people do a market assessment on the house, which he assumed I would be selling. I thanked him and declined. I also, in that same month, quietly listed the self-storage facility. I had been thinking about selling it for 2 years. It was time, and the market was right, and I saw no reason to wait. It sold in 3 weeks to a developer from Vaughan, which was a good outcome. I used a portion of the proceeds to fund a small scholarship at Cambrian College, in memory of Gerald, for students in the property management program. It seemed fitting. I did not, contrary to what Thomas seemed to believe, do any of this to hurt him. I want to be clear about that. I did it because I had spent 61 years building something, and I was not willing to spend the next 20 being managed out of it by people who had not paid attention. My granddaughter's name is Iris. She was 3 months old the day they moved out, and she looked up at me with those unfocused newborn eyes that don't quite see you yet, but seem to. I held her for a while in the hallway while Thomas loaded the last boxes into the car. He came back in for the final walkthrough, a habit from years of watching me do it with tenants, though he didn't know that, and he stopped when he saw me holding her. He stood in the doorway of his childhood home. Well, one of them. And he looked at me, and something shifted in his face, not all at once. In the slow way things shift when someone has been working something out for a while and has finally arrived at the answer. He said, "Mom, how much do you actually have?" I said, "Enough." He was quiet. Then he said, "I was an idiot." I said, "Yes." He laughed a little, the way you laugh when the alternative is worse. I handed him Iris. He held her against his chest and leaned against the door frame, and I thought, not for the first time, that he looked so much like his father and so little like him at the same time. Over the following months, things changed slowly. Claire was harder. She had more pride than Thomas, which in some ways I respect, and she took longer to find her way to an apology that was genuine rather than transactional. It came eventually. In my kitchen, funnily enough, the new kitchen I had finally renovated after they moved out. Because I had been wanting to for years and had never quite gotten to it. She came over for coffee and she sat down and she said without preamble that she had treated me badly and that she was sorry. I said I appreciated that. I meant it. I am 63 now. I still drive a practical car, though slightly newer. I still get the newspaper in print. I still use coupons, though these days it is less about necessity and more about principle. I eat dinner with Thomas and Claire and Iris every other Sunday, and Claire's mother has never mentioned the market assessment again, which I consider progress. Last month, Thomas asked if I would ever consider putting him on as a co-manager of the Guelph properties, not as an owner, as a manager, learning the work. I told him I would think about it seriously, which I am. What I know, what I have always known, is that the quietest rooms are sometimes the fullest ones. My father got that wrong in his own life, but he planted the idea in me by negative example, and I have carried it a long way from Sudbury. I still have the feeder in the backyard. The birds come every morning, same as always, indifferent to everything that happened in that house. I sit with my coffee and I watch them, and I think about Iris growing up, and about what I want her to know when she's old enough to ask. I think I will tell her that a woman who controls her own life quietly is not invisible. She is just waiting for the right moment to be seen. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, turning it over the way you turn a stone in your hand, not looking for anything in particular, just getting familiar with the weight of it. What strikes me most, looking back, is how long things had been accumulating before anything was said out loud. The comments about my kitchen. The way Claire spoke past me rather than to me. Thomas going quiet when he should have spoken. None of it happened overnight. It built the way most things build, slowly, in the background, while everyone is busy pretending not to notice. I don't think Thomas is a bad person. I've never thought that. What I think is that he got comfortable, and comfort, when it goes unexamined, can quietly turn into something else. He stopped asking questions he should have asked. Not about my finances, about me. About who I was before I was his mother. About how I had spent 40 years making decisions that most people never knew about. He stopped being curious, and when you stop being curious about the people closest to you, you start filling in the blanks with assumptions. His assumptions about me were, as it turned out, quite wrong. What saved him, I think, was that underneath the comfort and the assumptions, he still had enough honesty left to recognize the moment when it arrived. When he stood in that hallway holding Iris and said, "I was an idiot," that took something real. Not intelligence, not strategy, just the basic willingness to look at yourself clearly and say the true thing, even when it costs you something. That willingness is its own kind of strength, and I have never taken it for granted in him since. Claire took longer, and I respect that in a strange way. She came to her apology on her own terms when she was ready, and she meant it. An apology that comes too easily often doesn't carry much. Hers carried weight. As for me, I won't pretend I handled everything perfectly. There were moments I could have said something sooner, clearer. I have always leaned toward patience and quiet over confrontation. And sometimes patience is wisdom, and sometimes it is just avoidance wearing a better coat. I am still working out which one it was in those particular months. But I do believe this. The choices that hold us together over a lifetime are not the dramatic ones. They are the small, repeated decisions to keep building, keep learning, keep showing up with honesty intact. I built those properties one at a time over decades because I understood that something real takes time and attention and a refusal to cut corners. I tried to raise Thomas with the same understanding, and I think it mostly took, just not all at once, and not without a few hard lessons along the way. That is how most real things work. Not in a single revelation, in the long accumulation of choices, consequences, and the willingness to keep going after both. Iris is nearly 2 now. She pulls herself up on the furniture and looks around the room with the most serious expression, like she is taking inventory. I watch her and I think there is everything still ahead of her, every choice still unmade. I hope when the time comes, she knows that the quietest people in the room are sometimes the ones who have done the most work, and that the work is always worth doing, even when no one is watching, especially then.